It was a cold February morning in Ottawa when the unspoken rules of a continent were rewritten. The announcement, buried initially in a technical defense procurement strategy, landed like a thunderclap in the corridors of power from Capitol Hill to the Palais des Nations in Geneva. Canada, for the first time since the depths of the Cold War, declared a form of financial and military independence from the United States, earmarking nearly 500 billion Canadian dollars not just for defense, but for a fundamental recalibration of its national sovereignty. It was a ledger sheet that read less like a budget and more like a declaration of intent, a calculated bet that the cost of autonomy, however steep, was now preferable to the price of subservience. The message, delivered by a prime minister known for his central banker's calm, was unmistakably stark. The era of quiet compliance was over. The hook that dragged this simmering resentment into the global spotlight was not a diplomatic cable or a leaked memo, but a series of public provocations from the American president. Having long mused about the asymmetry of the trade relationship, Donald Trump's rhetoric escalated from tariff threats to existential taunts, publicly floating the idea of Canada as the 51st state and reportedly engaging with fringe elements that threatened the very fabric of Canadian territorial integrity. For a nation that defines itself in opposition to its boisterous southern neighbor, these were not just insults, they were existential challenges. The final straw, however, came not in a tweet, but in the sterile environs of the World Economic Forum in Davos, where Trump's administration abruptly revoked Canada's seat at a proposed Board of Peace, a move seen in Ottawa as a petty and public degradation. To understand the magnitude of the rupture, one must first appreciate the depth of the integration that preceded it. For over 8 decades, the defense relationship between the United States and Canada has been the gold standard for bilateral military cooperation, a web of agreements so dense it practically fused the two nations' strategic identities. The foundation was laid in 1940 at Ogdensburg, New York, where Franklin D. Roosevelt and Mackenzie King pledged mutual assistance in continental defense, a pact that would evolve into the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, the highest level of institutionalized military dialogue between any two nations on Earth. By 1957, this partnership crystallized into the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, a binational command so integrated that Canadian and American officers sit side by side in a Cheyenne mountain complex, monitoring the skies for threats aimed at either nation. This integration was not merely operational, it was industrial and economic, codified in the Defense Production Sharing Agreement of 1959. This landmark accord effectively treated the Canadian defense industry as a domestic American source for the Pentagon, tearing down the border for military procurement and weaving Canadian factories into the supply chains of the American war machine. For decades, this arrangement offered Canada a seemingly perfect bargain: access to cutting-edge American technology and the protective umbrella of the U.S. military, all for a fraction of the cost of building an independent defense apparatus. But as Canadian economists and strategic analysts have recently pointed out with increasing alarm, this bargain came with a hidden compound interest, a slow bleed of sovereignty and industrial capacity. The fine print of the Defense Production Sharing Agreement reveals the inherent imbalance that critics now decry. While the agreement opened doors, it also ensured that high-value, complex system integration and prime contracting remained firmly in American hands. Canadian firms, despite their competitiveness, were systematically relegated to the role of parts suppliers, building components for American platforms rather than developing complete weapon systems of their own. Prime Minister Mark Carney, drawing on his deep experience in global finance, articulated this frustration with surgical precision, noting that for every Canadian dollar spent on defense, 75 cents flowed irrevocably south of the border, enriching the American industrial base while starving Canada's own capacity for innovation. It was, as one analyst put it, a silent tax on Canadian sovereignty paid in the currency of technological dependency. The current crisis, therefore, is not a spontaneous eruption, but the culmination of years of fraying trust, accelerated dramatically by the return of a transactional American president. The immediate flashpoint is the fate of the F-35 Lightning II, a fifth-generation fighter jet that Canada tentatively agreed to purchase 88 of in a deal now valued at nearly $30 billion. To NORAD commanders, the F-35 is non-negotiable. Its sensor fusion and stealth capabilities are essential for defending the continent's Arctic frontier against Russian bombers and cruise missiles, and having both nations fly the exact same aircraft ensures seamless interoperability. To a growing chorus in Ottawa, however, the F-35 represents the ultimate golden handcuff, a weapons system where the U.S. government retains control over the source code, the software updates, and even the ability to ground the fleet remotely should political winds shift. The warning from Washington has been blunt and delivered without diplomatic niceties. U.S. Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra has made it clear that any deviation from the F-35 procurement path will be viewed as a breach of trust with direct consequences for NORAD itself. If Canada chooses a different aircraft, he argues, the United States would be forced to fill the resulting capability gap, likely by increasing American military flights over Canadian territory, a move that would fundamentally alter the nature of the partnership and deeply wound Canadian national pride. This heavy-handed pressure, viewed from Ottawa, only confirms the very vulnerability Canada seeks to escape, the risk of having its sovereign airspace policed by a foreign power with its own interests at heart. In response, the Carney government has begun to methodically dismantle the architecture of dependency. The centerpiece of this strategy is a dramatic shift in defense procurement, mandating that 70% of military equipment spending be directed toward domestic industry, a reversal of the historical ratio that favored American suppliers. To back this up with action, Ottawa is actively courting alternatives to the F-35. The Swedish defense firm Saab has been invited to pitch its Gripen E fighter, a rugged, cold-weather-capable aircraft that comes with a transformative offer: full assembly and maintenance in Canada, creating an estimated 12,600 jobs, and crucially, transferring technology and system control to the Canadians. It is an offer that speaks directly to the heart of the sovereignty debate. This push for autonomy extends beyond fighter jets. Canada has taken the unprecedented step of joining the European Union's massive defense fund, the European Defense Fund, becoming the first non-European nation to secure a foothold in a procurement system explicitly designed to reduce reliance on American hardware. The logic is as elegant as it is subversive. By diversifying its defense partnerships, Canada is building leverage. It is signaling to Washington that the bilateral relationship is no longer a monopoly, that there are other customers and other collaborators in a world where American reliability is no longer a given. The move was celebrated in Brussels and Berlin, but received in Washington with a stony silence that spoke volumes. The rupture runs deeper than mere procurement contracts. It touches the very essence of how the West views its security architecture. At the Munich Security Conference, a perennial gathering of the transatlantic elite, the mood was described by participants as funereal. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, once a staunch Atlanticist, declared bluntly that the rules-based international order no longer exists, a sentiment echoed by French President Emmanuel Macron, who has long argued for European strategic autonomy. The American security guarantee, the bedrock of Western defense since 1945, is now viewed by its closest allies as a conditional, perhaps even transactional commodity. For Canada, watching these developments from North America, the implication is inescapable. If Europe can no longer rely on Washington, how can Ottawa? The economic dimensions of this schism are equally profound. Donald Trump's tariff policies targeting Canadian steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber have been interpreted in Ottawa not as trade disputes, but as acts of economic warfare against a partner. These tariffs undercut the very foundation of the integrated North American economy, a system designed to make the continent a competitive powerhouse. By weaponizing trade, the Trump administration has shattered the implicit trust that allowed the Defense Production Sharing Agreement to function. Canadian industry, once eager to integrate with American supply chains, is now being told by its own government to prepare for a future where that border is no longer seamless, but a barrier. Within the Canadian body politic, the shift is seismic and, for the first time in living memory, enjoys a fragile cross-partisan consensus. The left-leaning New Democratic Party has been the most vocal, calling for an outright cancellation of the F-35 contract and accusing the United States of holding Canada's Air Force hostage. But even conservative voices, traditionally the most Atlanticist and pro-American in the Canadian spectrum, have grown quiet in their opposition to Carney's pivot. The repeated questioning of Canadian sovereignty by the American president has had a unifying effect, creating a rare moment of national purpose in a country often fractured by regional and linguistic lines. To be seen as weak on American bullying is now political poison. The path forward is littered with immense practical hurdles. Breaking 70 years of industrial integration is not like flipping a switch. It is like rerouting a river. Canada's defense industry, while competent, lacks the capacity to instantly absorb the massive influx of capital and contracts promised by the new strategy. Building a fighter jet from scratch or even assembling one under license requires a skilled workforce and a supply chain that has been deliberately atrophied for decades. Experts at the Wilson Center in Washington have warned that the Carney government's promises, while bold, face three immediate tests: the negotiation of a new security agreement with the U.S., the federal budget's ability to fund these ambitions, and the NATO summit in Ankara, where Canada's actual spending will be scrutinized by allies. If Canada stumbles in these tests, the consequences could be severe. The United States holds significant leverage, and the Trump administration has demonstrated a willingness to use it. Analysts predict that any failure by Ottawa to meet its new defense spending targets or any perceived bad faith in renegotiating security agreements would be met with the swift reimposition of devastating tariffs. The logic in Washington is straightforward. If Canada wants to buy European and build its own weapons, it cannot also expect unfettered access to the American market that has historically subsidized its prosperity. This is the high-stakes poker game now playing out across the continent. The global reverberations of this feud are already being felt. America's adversaries are watching closely, calculating the opportunities presented by a divided West. Russia, whose strategic bombers regularly test NORAD's response times along the Alaskan and Canadian coasts, sees the discord as validation of its efforts to sow division. China, too, views the unraveling of the U.S.-Canada front as a strategic win, potentially complicating American efforts to build a unified coalition in the Indo-Pacific. For the first time since the Cold War, the concept of Fortress North America has a potential weak seam, not in its radar coverage, but in the political trust required to man its defenses. Looking ahead, the most likely scenario is a prolonged period of tense and messy renegotiation. The F-35 review, initially expected to conclude in late 2025, has dragged on, with Canada employing a strategy of walking and chewing gum simultaneously, paying initial deposits to keep its place in the production line while actively exploring alternatives. This hedging strategy buys time, but it also annoys Washington, which sees it as an attempt to have it both ways. The coming months will reveal whether Canada can actually secure a deal with Sweden for the Gripen, and whether that deal can survive the inevitable political and military pressure from the Pentagon. There are those who believe this crisis is merely a temporary aberration, a storm that will pass with a change of leadership in Washington. But the weight of evidence suggests a more permanent shift. The investments Canada is making, the partnerships it is forging in Europe, and the industrial strategy it is pursuing are not short-term tactics. They are long-term strategic realignments. Even if a future American president were to extend an olive branch, the trust required to reintegrate the defense industries and procurement cycles may be irreparably damaged. Once a nation decides to build its own key, it is unlikely to throw it away. For the United States, the stakes are existential to its status as a global leader. If its closest neighbor and most trusted ally feels compelled to build a defensive moat against American influence, what message does that send to allies in Tokyo, Seoul, or Berlin? The America First doctrine was designed to extract better deals from allies, but in the case of Canada, it may have inadvertently triggered the opposite, a wholesale allied retreat from the American orbit. The Pentagon's nightmare scenario is a NORAD where the two partners are no longer interoperable, where American jets cannot communicate securely with Canadian ground stations, and where the Arctic becomes a patchwork of competing, rather than cooperating, national interests. The irony is not lost on historians of the alliance. For decades, Washington pushed its allies to spend more on defense, complaining of free riders. Now, when Canada finally decides to spend massively, it plans to spend that money on itself and its European partners, effectively excluding the very American defense contractors who lobbied for the increases. The U.S. defense industry, a powerful lobbying force in Washington, faces the loss of billions in guaranteed revenue from the F-35 program and other contracts. The Buy American push from the White House has met its match in a Buy Canadian response, creating a protectionist spiral that weakens the collective defense of the continent. As the situation stands, the diplomatic channels between Ottawa and Washington remain open, but they are icy. Official statements are meticulously parsed, and back-channel communications have intensified. Both sides are acutely aware of the danger of letting the dispute spiral into a full-blown security crisis. There is still a cadre of generals and diplomats on both sides of the border who remember the value of the partnership and are working feverishly to find a compromise that allows both leaders to claim victory. But their room for maneuver is shrinking with every provocative headline. What happens if the talks fail? Scenario planners in both capitals are dusting off worst-case playbooks. A Canadian withdrawal from the F-35 program could trigger a cascading series of American retaliatory measures, including the cancellation of shared military exercises, the restriction of intelligence sharing under the Five Eyes alliance, and the aforementioned increase in unilateral U.S. military activity in the Canadian Arctic. This would not be a state of war, but it would be a state of profound cold peace between neighbors, a situation with no modern precedent and unpredictable consequences. The human cost of this geopolitical drama is being borne by the personnel who serve in the integrated commands. Canadian and American airmen and women who have served together for decades, who trust each other with their lives, now watch as their political leaders draw lines in the sand. The cohesion of units like NORAD relies on a culture of mutual respect and common purpose. If that culture is poisoned by political animosity, the operational effectiveness of the alliance will degrade, regardless of what the treaties say. It is this intangible bond, perhaps more than any weapon system, that is most at risk. In the midst of this uncertainty, Prime Minister Carney has sought to frame the moment as a generational opportunity. In speeches, he has cast Canada's move not as an act of anti-Americanism, but as a necessary adaptation to a multipolar world. He argues that middle powers, nations like Canada and the European states, must band together to protect the liberal international order that the superpowers are abandoning. It is a lofty vision, but one that resonates with a Canadian public tired of being taken for granted. It recasts the conflict from a petty squabble into a principled stand for national dignity. The United States, for its part, views the situation through the lens of power and credibility. To allow Canada to defect from the F-35 program and the broader defense integration framework would set a dangerous precedent. Other allies, from Britain to Australia, might be emboldened to seek their own independent paths, fracturing the web of alliances that underpins American global hegemony. For President Trump, whose entire political brand is built on strength and winning, conceding ground to Canada on this issue is politically unthinkable. And so, the two nations find themselves locked in a classic security dilemma where actions taken by one to increase its own security are perceived by the other as decreasing theirs. Looking toward the horizon, the next 12 months will be decisive. The NATO summit in Ankara will serve as a public report card on who is pulling their weight. The ongoing negotiations for a new bilateral security and economic agreement are approaching a make-or-break point, and the U.S. midterm elections will test the durability of the Trump administration's foreign policy approach. Through it all, the fundamental question remains, can two democracies sharing the longest undefended border in the world and a history of unparalleled cooperation find a way to reconcile their differences, or has the trust that bound them finally snapped? The answer to that question will determine the future of the North American continent. A cooperative North America remains an economic and military titan capable of projecting stability and prosperity. A fractured North America, by contrast, becomes a zone of friction, vulnerable to exploitation by global rivals. The infrastructure of the partnership, the pipelines, the power grids, the supply chains, the radar lines, was built on the assumption of permanent goodwill. Once that goodwill is replaced by suspicion, the cost of maintaining that infrastructure, both financially and politically, skyrockets. For the average citizen in Windsor or Buffalo, the crisis remains abstract, a topic for cable news pundits. But its effects are slowly trickling down. Border wait times for commercial traffic are increasing due to new security checks. Investment decisions are being delayed as companies wait to see if the trade environment stabilizes. And a quiet anxiety pervades communities that have long defined themselves by their cross-border connections. The psychological wall being built is, in some ways, more damaging than any physical barrier could ever be. In the end, the Canadian decision to leave the U.S. military pact, as the headlines put it, is less about a clean break and more about a fundamental renegotiation of the terms. It is Canada finally presenting the bill for decades of unequal partnership and demanding payment in the currency of sovereignty. Whether the United States is willing to meet that demand or whether it will let the relationship wither is the defining question of North American geopolitics for a generation. The world watches as two friends discover if they can remain friends, now that one has decided to stand on its own 2 feet, even if it means standing apart. As the snow melts on Parliament Hill and the cherry blossoms prepare to bloom in Washington, the silence between the two capitals is deafening. The hotlines are still manned, the treaties are still in force, and the flags still fly. But beneath the surface of normalcy, the tectonic plates of the alliance have shifted. The era of unthinking partnership is over. What comes next? A mature partnership of equals or a cold and distant coexistence will be written in the contracts for fighter jets and the routing of NORAD patrols for decades to come. The world's most successful international relationship has entered its most dangerous chapter, and there is no map for the way out.